It's such a delight to follow the people who have spoken on this webcast already, and I do just want to provide my thanks and highlight the contribution they're making. Floyd and UBI Works, the investment you've made in this, the tireless hours that you put forward, not just in getting the report to this point, but in your advocacy to this stage, have all been critical in keeping UBI front and center in the Canadian policy discussion and debate. So thank you for that. CANCEA, thank you for taking this project on and for doing the research and the detailed modeling that led to the results that are clearly and transparently outlined here. It's been a major contribution, so thank you. Hugh Siegel, thank you for the years that you've put into this. Thank you for the advocacy that you've brought to this from not just a conservative perspective, but from the perspective of one of the most impactful Canadians that we've seen in your generation and really in the last 50 years in Canada. Thank you for your tireless efforts. It's great to see Benjamin Tall join me on this webcast, and I think it underscores the point that Jesse made with the spot that CANCEA is going to have with Bloomberg, that this is not a fringe issue. This is not an issue that is limited to advocacy by social justice advocates, social workers, or people who are focused only on the social welfare programs in Canada. It is an economic issue. It is a growth issue. It is a productivity issue, in addition to being a justice issue. And that's why you're seeing people like Ben and myself from Bay Street banks, from economic research groups, that speak to a variety of sectors and stakeholders in the Canadian economy, coming out in support of the work that you're seeing reviewed here today. Lastly, I want to thank Jesse for chairing this today, for documenting the human face of UBI. Today, we're talking a lot about numbers because talking about the numbers is critical to advancing the discussion. But as an economist, I always keep in mind that we're working in a social science space, and social is about people. And Jesse, you're documenting effectively the faces of the people that UBI affects. And we should always keep in mind that everything we're discussing today is about the well-being of people. That said, my role as an economist in the discussion today is to go through the numbers. And that's what I'm going to do, because I want to give you context for the report, context for the UBI discussion, and some ammunition for the discussion, debates, and things that you'll see in the press as this goes forward, so that you can make sense of them, think about them critically, and formulate arguments that reflect your experience and the modeling and evidence that's being presented today in a way that's compelling to keep this discussion moving forward. First off, on the numbers, we are looking at what are truly large numbers in terms of the impact from a potential UBI or guaranteed basic income scheme. At up to $80 billion a year in additional GDP, that puts the impact of a guaranteed basic income or universal basic income on par with two other major policy proposals that have received a lot of attention this year and in the recent past. First off, we at Scotiabank have been advocating for more concerted and deeper efforts to ensure a universal childcare system is created in this country, as not just a measure to ensure that we have greater and preserve greater participation of women in the labor force, but again, as an economic issue. As we reopen, as we continue to grapple with the pandemic in the meantime, we are seeing substantial bottlenecks develop in the economy because people are being forced to choose between looking after their children and working. And therefore, childcare as an economic issue is critical to not only spurring the recovery out of the pandemic this year, but ensuring that we have higher rates of growth and better outcomes for everyone going forward. The IMF and other studies have estimated that a proper childcare system would add 4% of GDP to the Canadian economy over time, just as a universal basic income would do. The other big possible impact on Canadian GDP that is mooted as having about a 4% impact is greater free trade, greater labor mobility, greater opportunities to business between the provinces in Canada. And so I mentioned both of these because it also is estimated at about a 4% of GDP impact by places like the IMF and other independent analysts. So, UBI stands head and shoulders with other big policy priorities that could have a substantial and really immediate impact on Canadian growth and human well-being. There's no question we don't have to look at the modeling, though we should in this report, to know that cash transfers to low-income Canadians have a positive impact on their well-being and a positive impact on Canadian economic growth and broader well-being. We've had two big national experiments that complement the smaller pilots that we saw in Ontario more recently and in Manitoba some years ago. First off, over the last 6 years, we've seen a big increase in the benefits paid to working families through the Canada Child Benefit, which has also been stepped up. That has been instrumental in bringing hundreds of thousands of Canadian families out of poverty. As Hugh mentioned, we've also had the CERB and its successors over the last 9 months of the pandemic in Canada. And we've seen that the impact of cash transfers to low-income working people in some cases, in other cases, depending on the nature of the transfer to those who are not working, has been massively important in preserving Canadian economic activity and well-being this year particularly. The old concern, amongst some that people would blow conditional or cash transfers, whether they're conditional or not, on the proverbial pop and chips has been shown, at least in the aggregate, to be a completely misfounded fear. In fact, what Canadians have done has been to massively boost their savings, bring down some of their debt burdens, and use funds for things like childcare, training, and other basic needs. In fact, it's worth, as I mentioned in our virtual UBI March, setting cash transfers to low-income people in the context of promises that have been made for decades, that as we liberalize the Canadian economy, opened up labor markets, opened up capital markets, and opened up trade with the rest of the world, we acknowledge that some people would be adversely affected, even as it grew the pie of the Canadian economy as a whole. And we did say all the way along, from the Canada Free Trade Agreement with the United States in 1988 to the recent redevelopment or renovation of NAFTA, that we would ensure transfers would be made to help people retrain, relocate, and participate in the new opportunities that freer markets would open up. We've never made entirely good on those promises. And so a universal basic income isn't just about coping with the after effects or the current effects of the pandemic. It's also making good on promises that have been decades in their satisfaction. It's really clear that some of the old ways of helping low-income households and kickstarting growth aren't going to be entirely the solution to this year's recession and recovery. In the past, we've looked at things like physical infrastructure to kickstart growth, shovel-ready projects, and spending on capital goods that would produce benefits over a long period of time. But we know most of the people who are out of work right now aren't civil engineers, and in many cases aren't construction workers who would normally be involved in large projects. They're people in the service sector where physical distancing is difficult and where getting people back to work is going to remain a long-term difficult project. Those people are going to need support for a significant period of time. And as Andrew Yang mentioned, many of those jobs aren't coming back anytime soon, and they're going to need help transitioning into other sectors. That's what a universal basic income can help to do. Now, most of the debate around a universal basic income, as I mentioned, especially in the context of the Canada Child Benefit and the CERB, isn't about whether it can boost growth. And it isn't about whether it can improve the economic well-being of low-income people. It's usually about, can it be paid for? And here, despite the really excellent modeling in this report, I do want to introduce a little bit of caution to our rhetoric. I'm not sure that it advances our political cause when we say UBI, or a guaranteed basic income, will pay for itself. Because even in this very sympathetic independent report, it pays for itself over an extended period of time, over what can be up to 25 years, depending upon the assumptions that we employ. And so, I don't think we should accept the rhetorical bar that for universal basic income to be a positive thing for Canada, it has to pay for itself, or it has to pay for itself in the next 5 to 10 years or in the cycle of a single government. We don't ask that of the physical infrastructure that we're investing in through things like the new Canada Infrastructure Bank that are the priority for the new Deputy Minister of Finance. We shouldn't expect something greater out of universal income, basic income, than those projects. Our bar should be, does it pay for itself in terms of broader returns to the economy over time, some of which generate higher taxes, but not all of which are going to lead to tax revenue perfectly offsetting the costs of a universal basic income. It is important, as the report notes, that there is a timing consistency here. The costs are going to be bigger up front, and the benefits are going to be delivered more gradually over time. We shouldn't try to sweep that under the table. We should be clear about that, and clear that some of the big benefits from a universal basic income are not limited to things that we can monetize or identify in monetary terms clearly up front. One of the greatest benefits of this type of policy reform is the volatility reduction that it provides to low-income households so that they can plan over time. They can undertake education. They can change the precarity of the housing that they're involved in. They can support parts of their extended family or friend network in ways that they wouldn't be able to otherwise able to do, because they know what's coming. They know that they are going to have this basic level of support. I think what I would underscore is a few complementary policy ideas that we can inject into our discussions advocating for and defending a universal basic income framework. First off, is that it is clear that inflation and inflationary effects from these cash transfers are a non-issue right now. When we look over the last decade or so, we have consistently undershot, not overshot, the Bank of Canada's inflation target. And that's because we've faced persistent weak demand, which has translated into weak investment by companies. The biggest thing we can do to try to boost growth and actually get inflation back toward the target is put more cash in people's pockets. We also are in a situation right now where we have the lowest funding costs or debt costs in our lifetimes. Interest rates are at record lows, and there's been a bit of a debate over what this should mean for debt management by the Canadian government. It should mean much longer durations and maturities in the debt that we issue to lock in those low costs, because if we do so, it makes the calculus on the time required for something like universal basic income to pay for itself that much simpler and easier and more manageable. Lastly, we did talk a little bit earlier about what the bar is for making universal basic income an economically sound idea in the macro sense. Not so much in terms of how does it impact people's lives, but can we finance it over time? Here, people like David Dodge, the past governor of the Bank of Canada, suggested that any spending and investment should be framed in terms of, does it generate growth rates that exceed the interest rate we would have to pay on the related debt? And I think this report absolutely makes good on the notion that universal basic income can satisfy that criterion. It's a key criterion for debt sustainability, and it doesn't imply that it has to pay for itself in a way that we don't expect other investments to do in just a few years. It says it needs to pay for itself gradually over time so that our capacity to bring down our debt in uh, concurrent ways with our spending remains in place. And so those are a few things I think we need to keep in mind as we go forward and push for universal basic income in a way that's practical, pragmatic, and pursues greater justice for low-income people. I think it complements as well other things that we should always keep in mind as creating the space for universal basic income. We should keep pursuing higher minimum wages, a progressive tax system that actually does ensure greater equality after tax, and we should ensure that the government makes good on its promise in the September throne speech to move tax filing in Canada to a free and automatic system so that some of the delivery models for universal basic income become simpler, easier, and the foundations for them are already in place. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I so look forward to the discussion with the great questions we're seeing coming in and the people that Floyd, Jesse, and UBI have brought together. It's a privilege to be part of this. Thank you. If I may, I would just build on that by saying what we've seen from the 2008 financial crisis and from the experience of the lockdowns this year is that creating abundant liquidity with low interest rates that makes it easy for businesses and households to borrow is a necessary condition to getting us through difficult times, but it's not sufficient, particularly now when we've seen households boost savings massively and cut back in some areas on spending, and business over the last decade in Canada has consistently not invested at the rates that most of us in the economic modeling world would have expected when borrowing is so cheap. We need to do more. We need to ensure that low-income people have money in their pockets to create consumer demand, and that creates the conditions that build confidence for businesses to invest in additional capacity, which then leads to jobs, which is essentially the virtuous circle that we like to talk about in economics. And that only happens when they see the demand for their goods and services and they see lower risk around undertaking that debt. And that's not just the case for businesses, but obviously it's the case for households too. There are, a variety of loan products that are available right now that households in trouble aren't taking because we're small businesses that are run by just a few people aren't taking because they don't know what things are going to look like 6 months or a year from now. So cheap money isn't a sufficient condition to sustain growth. It's a necessary condition in difficult times, but it needs to be complemented by things that take risk down, provide incentives for businesses to invest, and allow people, particularly low-income people, to spend. And that's where universal basic income can be an important part of the policy discussion to build on the remarks that Hugh just made.
How does the Bank of International Settlements, like the IMF, WTO, and the World Bank are part of this, and other private institutions like Scotiabank affect the potential of national banking in a public credit structure? To be more direct, the monetary financial structure seems impotent for large scale and longer term national investment opportunities like UBI.
Well, I might come in on this being an alumnus of the IMF and the World Bank and working at Scotiabank right now in the financial system, with a view that actually, the financial system is not holding up recovery or rebuilding. In fact, interest rates and the availability of borrowing couldn't be lower and couldn't be more abundant than it is right now. And I'm going to come back to the comments I just made earlier. The problem is that businesses and individuals see too much risk ahead and don't see clear opportunities to invest in either creating businesses or spending because of that risk. And so it's an environment in which fiscal policy, spending by government, can come in and help reduce the perceptions of risk and put money into the pockets of people who are likely to spend it. And it is a classic moment in 100 years of economic theory that would say we clearly need more fiscal support for the economy right now, because the financial system and the cost of borrowing isn't what's holding us back right now. It's those risks, those uncertainties about the future, and worries in both households and businesses that they're not going to be able to pay the bills. And I just want to dovetail with that. There were a few questions I saw in the chat, and we saw my eyes going up and down. I was trying to get a sense of what people are talking about out there in the audience. There are a few questions about why we're talking about growth so much and why universal basic income could help growth when, on the one hand, growth has been environmentally destructive, it's used up resources, it's accelerated climate change, and degraded a whole lot of biosystems. That's certainly one side of growth. The other side of growth that boosts GDP, boosts economic activity in an economy is increased productivity. You can either grow by putting more inputs into the economy or by using them more efficiently. And I see UBI as one of the ways that increases the efficiency of growth, increases our productivity, and that's ultimately good for the environment. It's good for nature and good for all of us. So that's why I focus on growth here.